But as you can see there, Larry, as most of our guests today, has a great and storied career. You know, he's been with some of the absolute top media companies, media and entertainment companies across his career. And as traditional as some of those companies may be, though, Larry really stands out in terms of being at the forefront of what each one of those companies have done. You know, whether it's with respect to pay TV and being out in the forefront, independent content and what done with that in his time at Sundance. And quite frankly, he's done it again now with Iconic and being at a multi-channel network. And we'll certainly give you a little bit of taste as to what that is. But so Larry's operated across digital and traditional. He's operated with companies across the globe, and he'll talk to us a little bit about that. In terms of MCNs, again, another three-letter word that I think if you go out there in the public, people don't really know. It's certainly an absolutely burgeoning time, and I can speak with experience, right? So I was out at the beach this weekend, or Memorial Day weekend, 2 weekends ago. It was a little cold. Anyone here in the Northeast, it was a little cold that weekend. So we were inside more than we probably wanted to be. Well, my boys took the opportunity, and I'm embarrassed almost to admit how much time we spent watching Dude Perfect, which is not one of Larry's, but it is one of those MCNs that has just exploded. Dude Perfect, and they were mesmerized. My husband is among the boys who was mesmerized, and quite frankly, I got pretty mesmerized. It's very addicting, the content that's out there. But let's go to Larry's brand, and before I let Larry open, Larry was kind enough to bring a little clip just to give us a taste. So let's go there first.
I started this little thing called Life and Times.
I'm all for mixing it up. That's what lives are about. This channel that we're creating is a chance for women of all ages to come together and to learn from each other.
Attack the flow and walk your low. Express yourself, release and go. Attack the flow, dip low.
If you like local food, then I've got the place for you.
Express yourself, put your back in it. Put your back in it. Nah, put your back in it. Put your back in it. Nah, put your back in it. Then over, touch the flow. Get low. Nah.
So Larry, I'm going to open very similar to how Joe and Rich just did. Ask you to tell us a little bit about your personal journey, how it got you to Iconic, and really what Iconic is, the strategy, and what you're doing.
Cool. First of all, thank you for having us at Iconic here today. Second, just a constructive suggestion on that video you guys showed. I don't know if I'm the only one in this audience. I could not read any of those posts. So I would suggest either blowing them up or hiring somebody like Gary Busey to do the voiceover. But they were great. Once I turned and looked at the screen, I could read them. But that was really, it was a very smart thing. I just want to be able to read them next time. So we're going to talk mostly about disruption in the digital video space. But I do think it's worth just spending a moment on some of the earlier stuff I did, because notwithstanding all the rhetoric in the press about traditional media being kind of on its down track, I will say that the experience I got at Universal, Time Warner, and HBO, Viacom was quite helpful then, and I think now to what anyone who's doing digital video is going to need to be successful. In one sense, because once you've worked in one of those companies or worked with them, you learn a bit about working the system, and you still need those guys. I mean, there's no better way from the standpoint of what I call bright, shiny objects, shining a light on what you're doing in digital, and we'll talk about some examples of that, number one. Number two, I think one of the things I observed in all those cases was the ability, which took a certain amount of self-awareness, to say, you know, we can't necessarily do all this stuff ourselves. So one example of that, my first gig out of college was at a place which was then called MCA Universal. I'm dating myself because a guy called Lou Wasserman ran the studio, which is like saying I, was at MGM when they shot Gone with the Wind, but it's not quite that bad. But I happened to be first job working in the feature trailers department, becoming attractions down the hall from the guys who were making Animal House. And as the film became close to opening, I said, well, I'd love to become involved in this. And the studio, recognizing they did not have a marketing team that was necessarily equipped to target the college audience, brought in this other company. And my job, which I quickly joined, was setting up toga parties for about 6 to 9 months.
Now, there's some people here who know Larry. It's very fitting. Very, very fitting.
And this is, by the way, during an era which is hard to imagine now, where a film would actually stay in a theater for 6 to 9 months. And the only way to see it again was to go back to the theater again and again. And we just sort of poured gasoline on that fire. Same thing at HBO. When we went international, all those were invariably done with partners, because HBO recognized it either couldn't get the content or needed local leadership. And then at Sundance, which is the most obvious one, I think both Viacom and Polygram, the original parents, recognized, even though they had a desire to be in the independent film channel business, that it would be helpful to have a recognized brand. Last, I think, is, you know, those places, they both recognize their audience, and I think one of the things I learned in every one of them is brands matter. So, again, the film was called, most people say Animal House, it was actually called National Lampoon's Animal House. The National Lampoon brand meant a lot to anyone then, probably less so now, but between their high school yearbook parody and just a bunch of other things, that resonated. The case at HBO and Sundance just as obvious. And so to answer your question about iconic, we are an MCN, and we'll talk, I guess, a little bit more about MCNs in name only. We are a multi-channel network. That means we have more than one channel. We are, though, more focused than some of the others that you probably hear about more often, like Maker, Full Screen, et cetera. Our focus has been brand and creative, and almost always in joint ventures, and in most cases with talent, the people you saw on the screen. So I like that business of being in business with somebody like Redford or Jay-Z or Meredith Vieira as a partner rather than work for hire. It's sort of more motivating from a long-term value build standpoint. And so most of those are 50-50 joint ventures. And several of them, since this tape was cut, we've been in the process of selling off. So Iconic is close to being in somebody else's stable, at least most of the channels. I think we'll hold on to 1 or 2 for a while, but Meredith, for example, we have sold in recent months.
Let's stay there for a minute, because actually that's a trend that we're certainly seeing, whether it's Maker going to Disney, whether it's Machinima going to Warner Brothers,
Yep.
what you're selling off. Why are these channels so attractive to the traditional media companies?
Well, I think the reality is what most of those big MCNs have in common is a very, very significant understanding of an audience that, and the behavior of that audience that some traditional media companies have found very difficult to both attract and in many cases keep. It's that quite simply, and I think the reason Disney, a lot of people laughed at the time, but I think Disney will have the last laugh. They bought Maker because of its breathtaking reach. That's true of a lot of those MCNs, and I think, you know, as I made clear a moment ago, we sort of, self-awareness is a beautiful thing. I did not think, and still don't think that, and my partner Michael Hirschhorn and I took the belief that we are great at creating brands and creative. We are not great scale people, which is why we're now in the process of selling them to like-minded scale partners. But I think, you know, one of the most, and I've gotten pretty used to, because at a lot of these big companies, I learned a lot, but it was pretty clear at a certain point in my career I wasn't going to be in the leadership position at a big traditional media company, partly because of what you've already observed. I like doing stuff like setting up toga parties. So the thing about those disruptive companies and what I think I've gotten, it's not easy, but getting outside one's comfort zone, spending time either in Silicon Valley or internationally, I think we'll hopefully talk a little bit about, gets one to a place where you just understand and appreciate how other people think. So I've just become an advisor to a San Francisco-based company, which you may not have heard of, called Fandor, which on one level would remind you a lot of a previous company I ran, Sundance Channel, because it is independent film-centric, thousands of titles. It's an SVOD OTT brand. Its principal investor is a guy called Chris Kelly, who was Facebook's first general counsel, chief privacy officer, and has made some very smart investments in TMT. including the Sacramento Kings, Woven TV, and up-and-coming MCN.
Those were a lot of acronyms you just threw out there.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's more than PwC does.
I'll explain all of them in the after show. And I do want to use the word spelunking at least once on behalf of Jesse. So the thing that Silicon Valley DNA helps, I think, a lot and is underappreciated by some of the people that are trying to make it in this realm is they are very customer-centric and viewer-centric. And so the way Chris and the team at Fandor looks at its business is they've got product, but they are hyper-focused on analytics, the behavior of their audience. They are optimizing on an ongoing basis for both platforms and for devices, those that exist today, whether it's Facebook, Pinterest, et cetera, and those that will come. And they are also doing something which I think is an art, some science, but an art which is bridging the gap between the social behavior of that audience and the various, and the movies themselves. Because what a lot of audiences want, notwithstanding the mantra of more choice, is a recommendation. Why should you watch this documentary? Why should you watch this film? And yes, there's algorithms that do that, but I think one of their pride and joy is handpicked. And so I'm enjoying that experience. It is evocative of the independent film stuff we did at Sundance Channel, but it is also kind of built for the 2015 and beyond audience.
You know, you referred to consumer behavior in that, and delivering original programming to get to the broader consumer profile that we are looking at today, and the multifaceted world and the multi-device. You know, what's your feeling on that? What's working well? What's not working well today?
Well, let's talk about what's not working today, which I think it's good to admit your mishaps. At this moment, with 55%, which is probably the low end of our viewership on mobile, some would say it's as high as 70%. Most of the stuff you're seeing there is being watched by people whose ages begin with 1 and 2, which by the way, you surround. If you don't surround yourself, whatever you're doing today, if you don't surround yourself with kids, as I call them, we have a lot of them sitting around the office, for whom this is all instinctual. For us, it's a more somewhat academic. And by the way, when it comes to music, my tastes in music are like a vestigial organ. You know, I was into bands like REO Speedwagon in Boston, which I will never admit to Jay. But the reality is, I actually forgot the question. But no. So here's what hasn't worked. Long form. We did an episode, part of which went viral with Jay-Z, called, it was about 2 years ago, it's called Where I'm From. It was it was a half hour, completely traditional length. It was his final concert at Barclays when he did like 8 nights, when Barclays was actually opening. A piece of it went viral, which was him riding on the subway to the final concert. He was sitting next to an older woman who didn't know who he was. And there was a very cute conversation between the two of them, and she was asking why, you know, what he was up to, and she thought it was sweet. He was taking the subway, and he was extremely, you know, humble and self-effacing. And at a certain point, she realized who he was, and that minute or minute and a half went viral. Very few people, if you looked at the analytics, watched the whole thing. So short. We had another series on Uno Dos Tres called. It was a long-form docu-series with a guy called Juanes, who's a very big Latin star, and it was sort of following him on a tour of many Latin countries. Now let's talk about what has worked. We did a Where I'm From short form series last fall. Our head of content and sponsorship, a woman called Mary Liz McDonald, worked with the same franchise. Where I'm From, originally a half hour with people like Jay, but these were more like 4 to 8 minutes. And all 12 of them were people that most of us would never have heard of. What they all had in common is gigantic social footprints. Huge, you know, whether any number of Facebook, Pinterest, Snapchat following, so that when the thing went live, they were telling the audience about it. And it was a huge success. And by the way, the other thing which is different about the world today from the world, when I was at Sundance Channel and we were doing series we were very proud of, like Iconoclast and Elvis Costello's Spectacle, which were sponsored, we were not Nielsen rated. Sadly, those days are gone. Everything's now on a meter, And so you are reminded on every one of the things I've just described, you have to deliver views, you have to deliver impressions. And the good news is we have, and the last thing I'll say is, it's sort of gone full circle. We are now doing half-hour versions of those, but not for the YouTube ecosystem, but and they're premiering later this month. We're doing 4 half hours. I don't remember all of them, but one's with Robbie Cano, Jays, and 2 others, and they're going to be on Fusion, which is an emerging cable network, partially owned by Univision and Disney.
Which is back to what you talked about, the merging of the traditional
Yes,
and the
yes,
new
which is
world
why
coming back
you
together.
thumb your nose at what I call the old country at your peril, because they are still, the money is still, notwithstanding some of the hype, that is still where most of the money is from a licensing standpoint. It is also, from a promotional standpoint, I'll give you an example of that in a moment, there's no better place to tell people what you're up to.
So our outlook is global. We obviously talk about statistics. We talk about how things are different in different territories. You spend a fair amount of time global, now on the board of ProSieben. Talk to us a little bit about what's either different or the same going on around the
Okay,
world.
so ProSieben has been a magnificent experience for me. This is, for those of you who don't know, one of the largest media companies in Europe, based in Munich. And I'd say the same thing I was sort of alluding to earlier about Silicon Valley as I would say about international, because when I started to do international and was setting up HBO in Asia and Central Europe and elsewhere, you are humbled at all the stuff you don't know. Now, they brought in me and a couple of other Americans who are more Silicon Valley centric to sort of help them, Sherpa them through this terrain of digital meets traditional. Now, I will tell you, with no uncertainty, and by the way, the good folks at Egon Zehnder placed all of us, and we were certainly during the vetting process saying, oh yes, we know a lot more than you probably do, and I'm sure we can help. Without question, we have learned more from them, and this is a company, just to give you one example, which has the largest MCN in Germany. It's called Studio 71. It is literally only a year and a half old. And if it's the largest MCN in Germany, it means it's one of the largest MCNs in Europe. So Thomas Ebeling, the CEO, appointed a guy called Sebastian Weil. And Sebastian isn't in Munich. Sebastian and all the kids are in Berlin, which is a lot where more of the creative talent is. And I'm telling you, that going from zero to where it is absolutely positively a function of the synergistic. The stuff we talked about earlier about siloing, I used to call schminergy when I was at Time Warner, where the divisions not only didn't talk to each other, but were actively trying to fuck each other. Synergy is alive and well at ProSieben, and the fact that this thing skyrocketed, I mean, they learned a lot, I think, by their investment in the collective, which is, I think, at 20% or something, but to get from zero to number one was absolutely a function of the emerging, and this is a YouTube affiliate, so it's a YouTube MCN that has talent that is shined upon by the ProSieben, Sat.1 and other channels in their bouquet, and I don't know if there's any case studies yet, but you know that some of these young talents will at some point be transitioning over to the television side, and it's just a very symbiotic and, to me, quite rare example of two things having been woven together seamlessly. In the U.S., I would probably point to, I mentioned Disney and Maker earlier. Disney is often at the forefront. It doesn't hurt when you have a strong leader to kind of break down silos and say, you guys are working together. And if you aren't, get out of here. And that has been pretty magnificent in a very short period of time.
Yeah, we heard Disney talk about that at the Moffett-Nathanson conference in terms of breaking down those silos. Also the big topic there, and even this morning so far, OTT unbundling, right? Everybody talked about that.
Yep.
Didn't hurt that they asked everybody about it.
Yes.
So I will ask you about it. Living in that world, what's happening with the business model? What's happening with the pricing model? Where do you see it going?
Okay, so first thing I'm going to say is, and when in the earlier conversation between Jesse and Marcel, I should have had that the other way around. Sorry, Marcel. The reality is, and I think this is a momentous year. If you worked at HBO at any time in your career, and there's a long list of alums, it was almost a parlor game of when is HBO going to be available a la carte, outside the bundle. And it was like a parlor game with Nathanson, who I think is one of the smartest guys in the room. And literally for a dozen years, we've been placing bets on when is it going to happen. The irony of this is I used to go to Washington. This is called shameless self-preservation. When I was in the cable business at Sundance, I'd go to Washington with Redford, for whom more doors opened than either the NCTA or Larry Aidem. And we would lobby against a la carte because the bundle was a beautiful thing. That's how Sundance Channel succeeded. But Sundance Channel, most people don't know this, launched as a mini premium. And it was a disaster. We were $6.99. It was easy in those days to blame the cable guys. Let me tell you something, and to cut to your question, I think there's going to be a wake-up call for a lot of people that OTT, while it's almost be careful what you wish for. There are a few people I think that are quite well positioned, already doing well. We've talked about some of them, Netflix, Hulu Plus. The only people in the traditional world who I think are fully prepared for this are HBO and Showtime, Stars, Epics, those who are already a la carte. There is a dirty little word that most people don't like to talk about, but it's one of the things you first learn when you're at HBO, and it's called churn. And today, not 20, I mean, HBO is almost 40 years old, but it was 50% in the 80s, and it's probably 50% today. And a lot of that's moves, but there is a gigantic amount of expense incurred in refilling what we used to call the leaky bucket. So if you're losing half your customers a year, just think about how much money you got to spend to replenish. And I just think with all these announcements about people going direct to consumer, I think there's going to be, and this was made, I think the point was made by Marcel and others, that we may go back in a direction where there's going to be some aggregators. You don't want to be, I don't think, if you ask anyone whose age begins with 1 or 2, how many services do you actually pay for? It's a really short list. How many are you getting from your parents? It's a long list. And so I think that, and I won't name names, but I've named the ones I think that will be around. But I think it's going to be humbling and instructive. And the last thing I'll say is, this is the old Bill Goldman line, which is, nobody knows nothing, has never been more apparent. Netflix did not have original programming 3 years ago, which is an unbelievable thing. I've talked about how fast things are moving in Germany with Studio 71. And by the way, I would add Germany to your list of countries. It's a very interesting place. But the corollary to that, which was the late Jake Eberts, who was on our board at Sundance and who produced a number of Redford's films, had a line which was, "A leading authority is someone who's guessed correctly more than once." And I think we're in that zone right now where nobody knows nothing. I'm giving you a take, but I think it's exciting in many cases. The one thing I'll say about the new world, is it's incredibly free of legacy rules. I don't hear the word MFN too often. I used to hear it all the time when I was being waterboarded at renewal time. But it's a really exciting time, I think, and the mix of these two, just to finish where I began, of needing the traditional. And I think we were going to talk a little bit about joint ventures, but part of the reason, if we're out of time, I don't know if we're out of time, but
we can talk about
the reason you do joint ventures and the reason I think the two are symbiotic and need each other is because of the real fact, and it defines a lot of the examples I've described today. Most of these, including iconic, are not wholly owned, and I think the reason everyone joint ventures can be a really difficult and bad thing, like marriages. But there's a reason people do them, which is I'd rather own a third or a quarter or a half of something than 100% of nothing. And I think a lot of these are being defined, these alliances, by people who need each other. And the only thing I would say is date before you get married.
It's a great advertisement for our thesis on joint ventures. With that, we are out of time.
Yep.
And I'll go back to where you ended. It's an exciting time. Larry's in the forefront of that. We thank him.
Thank
for being
you.
here.
Thank you.